Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this meeting Beyond Limits. It's a project of the Sreda Obuchenia University. My name is Ekaterina Nikitina. I am a researcher in the fields of posthumanism, animal studies, and contemporary art. And today I'm happy to greet Stelarc. Stelarc, who is a legendary Australian performance artist who conducts experiments with his own body, augmenting it through prosthetics, contemporary technologies, and other technical means. Many of you are familiar with his performance called hands writing, when he was using both his hands and a robotic prosthetic arm to write the word evolution. Extra ear, internet ear, and ear on arm, which involve an additional organ that can completely change our perception of the environment and create a connection to remote locations. Using the ideas of monstrosity, chimericity, the ideas of identity and physicality, the artist keeps asking us questions about the limits of the human, about the capabilities of the body. What is body today? What is human being today? What relations are between humans and others, humans and machines? Stelarc's works are in the spotlight of contemporary philosophy, and they are questions about our existence, our ontology, and ethics. I'm happy to give the floor to Stelarc, and I wish you all happy listening, and I wish we'll have a fruitful discussion later on. The floor is yours.
The presentation today is about art actions and the ideas that they generate, and also some other interesting research in robotics. These projects and performances are about issues concerning embodiment, identity, agency, aliveness, what a body is and how a body operates in the world. In this age of information overload, what is important is not freedom of ideas, but rather freedom of form, freedom to modify your body. So for me, a zombie is a body without a mind of its own, a body that performs involuntarily. A cyborg is a hybrid human-machine system that becomes increasingly automated. We've always feared the involuntary, and we are anxious about becoming automated, but we fear what we have always been and what we have already become: cyborgs and zombies. We can now plastinate bodies and display them in ways that we couldn't display them before. Dead bodies no longer need to disintegrate, and dead bodies continue to have a material existence. So we can plastinate flesh. Cadavers can be preserved forever, whilst comatose bodies can be sustained indefinitely on technological life support systems, whilst cryogenically preserved bodies await reanimation at some imagined future. So what it means to be alive, what it means to preserve your body becomes increasingly blurred. The first suspension event, titled Stretch Skin. Here the skin is exhibiting a kind of gravitational landscape. This is what it takes to be suspended in a 1G gravitational field. The body here is counterbalanced by a ring of rocks, one rock for each insertion point. The body is gently swaying from side to side, setting up random oscillations in the rocks. This performance stopped when the telephone rang in the gallery. An up and down suspension in a shaft. And with the seaside suspension, the only people who saw this performance were a group of fishermen on another outcrop of rocks. They were fishing before we arrived. They were fishing during the performance, and they were still fishing when we left. The body here is suspended 60 meters above the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. In fact, after 30 meters, all I could hear was the whooshing of the wind, the whirring of the crane motors, and the creaking of the skin. So these suspensions are experiences in bodily sensation, expressed in bodily action, in remote spaces and in diverse situations. They're not actions for interpretation, nor do they require any explanation. They're not meant to generate any meaning. The body neither up or down, the body is neither here nor there. A performance in New York above East 11th Street. Here the body was prepared in a 4th floor room. When everything was connected, the body rolls out, finishes in the middle of the street. I had a good view of all the police cars that arrived within about 5 minutes. And what was meant to be a 30-minute performance was stopped after 12 minutes when the police pulled me back in. I was arrested for this performance, not because I performed some sadomasochistic event, not because of the public nudity, but rather had I fallen on someone. This performance began when the body lifted off the ground. I had a control box so I could choreograph my body's movements through the warehouse. I discovered that when I stopped and started suddenly, the body would swing. And this was an unexpected part of the choreography. And this performance ended when the body touched down. So the third hand was completed in 1980, and several years after, this was considered sophisticated enough to get invitations from the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena and the Johnston Space Center in Houston to demonstrate the hand to the extravehicular activity group. It's 3 degree of freedom, wrist rotation, a pinch release, a grasp release. It had a tactile feedback system for a rudimentary sense of touch. And initially it was just a visual aesthetic attachment to the body in performance. But as Ekaterina mentioned before, in this performance, writing one word, each hand writing a separate letter at the same time. I had to keep my 2 eyes on what my 3 hands were doing. And because of the spacing of the 3 hands, I had to remember every 3rd letter. So the prosthesis is not a sign of lack for me, but rather it's a symptom of excess. The body in the technological terrain that it inhabits is a body in excess. It's a body beyond its biology. In this performance, amplified body performance, lasers were directed to the eyes with optic fiber cable. And these, by controlling the muscles around the eyes, you could scribble in the space. You could draw images in the gallery space. But also, as well as visually extended, the body was acoustically amplified. So the sounds that you will hear now are amplified brain waves, heartbeat, blood flow, and muscle signals. So the body has become this contemporary chimera of meat, metal, and code, a kind of hyperhuman distributed in space and over different time zones, a hyperhuman that becomes more than the sum of its hyperlinks. And as McLuhan mentions, technology has become the external organs of the body. We have evolved as a biological body, a soft body with internal organs. And this allows us to interface and interact with the world. But in the technological terrain that we now inhabit, we have to engineer additional external organs to better interface with our machines and computational systems. The extended arm is an 11 degree of freedom manipulator. It has wrist rotation, individual finger movements, thumb rotation, and each finger splits open. So each finger becomes potentially a gripper in itself. And in this performance, the sounds that you hear are not internal body signals, but rather sounds generated by signals by the movement of the limbs. That performance was streamed live, and the artist was performing, improvising against his shadow projected on the wall, and the video streaming that was a video mix, a 4-channel video mix. It didn't take much imagination in the previous performance, because my left arm was involuntarily moving. Although my right arm was extended with the arm manipulator, my left arm was performing involuntarily. And this is the muscle signal control box. The blue switches indicate which muscles could be pre-programmed. And we had a touchscreen interface. This performance was in 1995, so it goes back a bit. But by touching the muscles on the computer model simulates your choreography. And a second later in Luxembourg, where my body was, my body moves involuntarily. So for 2 days, 6 hours every day, people in the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Media Lab in Helsinki, the Doors of Perception Conference in Amsterdam were able to remotely access and activate my body via that touch screen. And this is connected to a muscle stimulation system. The experience is not a split mind-body experience, but rather a split body experience. Voltage in on the left side, involuntary movement, pre-programmed computer-controlled movement. On the right side, voltage out, actuating my extended arm. So presence here becomes problematic. Presence is now marked by a double absence, or perhaps absence is marked by a double presence. We are neither all here nor all there, but partly here sometimes and partly somewhere else at other times. With ping body, instead of people in other places activating the body, here we use the ping protocol, pinging 30 global locations. The reverberating ping signals are measured in milliseconds and mapped to the body's muscles. So the body here becomes a kind of crude barometer of internet activity. The body performs more or less according to the activity on the internet. And with Parasite, we constructed a customized search engine that scans the internet, selects anatomical images from the web, projects them to my head-up display, and my body moves. Now, also the system is complicated by the fact that I have tilt sensors on my head, my arms and leg. So the body in this performance becomes the video mixer as well as the live video switcher. So the images that the artist sees are the images that moves his body. In an age of excess and mixed realities, the body performs beyond the boundaries of its skin and beyond the local space that it inhabits. The Ambidextrous Arm project was initiated by me at Brunel University. The idea here is that ambidextrously jointed, it means that the fingers can bend one way, the thumb rotates, you have a right hand, but the fingers can bend completely the other way. The thumb can rotate backwards, so you have a left hand and a right hand all in the one universal design. So all of these projects and performances are alternative anatomical architectures, experiments in augmenting, in extending, in exposing the biological body. Exoskeleton was a six-legged walking machine that we engineered in Hamburg with the help of F-18. This robot is actuated by my arm gestures. So sensors on the upper exoskeleton allow me to choose the leg movements with my arm gestures. The robot can walk forwards and backwards with the ripple gait, sideways with the tripod gait. The robot can squat, it can stand, it can stomp, it can turn on the spot. The exoskeleton was a 3-meter diameter robot. The muscle machine is 5 meters in diameter. It's a very large walking machine. And the idea here is that you translate a human bipedal locomotion into a 6-legged animal-like movement. So there are encoders on my legs. So lifting one leg up lifts 3 robot legs to lift and swing forward. So the robot walks by simply walking up and down. There are sensors in the chassis of the robot. So the robot detects which direction the artist wishes to go. So the intent with the walking head robot was to engineer an actual virtual system where the mechanical movements of the legs generate and animate the facial behavior of the head. Microbot is a project that I haven't been able to actualize yet. It's a robot that is small enough, robust enough to be able to climb up my tongue and into my mouth. I just have to be careful not to swallow. But with the increasing intimacy of technology, with technology becoming micro-miniaturized, technology no longer is merely a container of the body, but rather now it becomes a component. There's the possibility of recolonizing the human body with micro-miniaturized technology. And at a time now when the individual body can be threatened and fatally infected by biological viruses, the human species is confronted by the more pervasive and invasive ontological risk of infection by its techno-digital artifacts and entities. Why I showed this particular robot is what they call legs, this combination of wheels and legs. So here we're going beyond biomimicry. Biomimicry is often used in robotics, translating insect and animal manipulation and locomotion. But here it's going beyond biomimicry. It's this hybridization of the biological with engineering. Legs that are a combination of wheels and spokes. And of course, to point out here that what's interesting about robots as compared to the human body is that robots can be scaled from mega machines to wearable exoskeletons to micro and nanobots. Now, this is the Boston Dynamics robots. A very seductive mammalian gait, and the head or the neck becomes the manipulator. So with humanoid robots now, they can be engineered with appropriate athletic capabilities and imbued in the future with artificial intelligence, computational systems that can monitor and react to unpredictable situations, then these robots will increasingly interact socially with humans. There are two philosophical statements that I like to use. Nietzsche, who says, "There's no being behind the doing. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed." In other words, it's the action. We attribute agency retroactively. And Wittgenstein, who asserts that thinking is not located inside the head, it's located on the paper on which you write, with your lips which you speak.
But use some pieces of the fiberglass.
So in other words, these two philosophical statements allow us to better understand the situation with robots. If a robot can see what you see, if a robot can do what you can do, if it can react interactively in unpredictable situations, then that robot will be intelligent enough to be socially, to inhabit the social.
And it was a lengthy process of approximately 1 year to ensure that he met the true criteria to be the right patient for this transplant. And sure enough, he did meet this criteria. At that time, we described a procedure which would essentially restore everything which was not functioning and appearing normal on his face, which included portions of the scalp, through the forehead, the upper lower eyelids, the nose, upper lower lips, soft tissues of the chin, down to the level of the neck, and the underlying structures, which included the upper jaw, bones around the eye sockets, the upper teeth, the lower teeth, as well as the anterior portions of the tongue.
Dr. Rodriguez, he suffered a gunshot accident back in 1997. Amazingly, his sight wasn't affected. He still had his vision, but as you say, he can now smell something he probably hasn't been able to do, for 15 years. He's now talking. Tell us about the moment that he was able to do these things.
So the face from the donor body stitched to the skull of the recipient becomes a third face resembling neither. The partial head project was done for the Heidi Museum of Modern Art in Melbourne. The artist's face was scanned, as was a hominid skull. The human face was then digitally transplanted over the hominid skull, constructing a kind of third face, but this one becomes post-hominid but pre-human in form. The 3D printed scaffold from this, the data from the scanning, was seeded with living cells. And it got contaminated after a few days and had to be fixed in formaldehyde for the rest of the exhibition. But it was living for several days. So the partial head here is a partial portrait of the artist, which was partially living for part of the time of the exhibition. We can now scan a face and instantly produce a hyperreal skin. Faces now are flattened, screens now become interactive skins. And skins as screens are now attaining optical and haptic thickness. And it is this thickening coupled with the quickening of transmission that collapses the psychological space between remotely linked bodies.
Okay, so here's baby X, and this is, she's been learning to read words. So here's her first word book. So let's see what she can see. It's into a page. And here we go, let's see what what's this, baby? What's this? What's this? What's this? Good girl. Now see if she knows what the word is. Okay, baby, look over here. Okay, what's this? What's this? Good girl. Let's try her on something else. Okay, what's this? Baby, over here. What's this? Baby, look at me. Look at me. What's this? Baby, over here. Over here. Good girl. So that's what she's just read.
Okay, so that was the work of research of Mark Sagar at the University of Auckland. But of course, what's interesting is to factor what vocabularies, what choreographies generate a sense of aliveness. If you have a 3D model and you have enough morph targets, then you can generate enough facial expressions. You can program different kinds of behaviors. Baby X was modeled on Mark's baby. And you can see it's a combination of computer science, neurophysiology, but increasingly now computer entities, digital entities are not, cannot be distinguished on a screen, whether they are artificial or real people. So in this age of body hacking, gene mapping, prosthetic augmentation, organ swapping, face transplants, synthetic skin, what it means to be a body, what it means to be human, and what generates aliveness and agency becomes problematic. So in the spaces of proliferating prosthetic bodies, partial life, and artificial life, the body has become obsolete. Between 1973 and 1975, I made 3 films of the inside of my body. The body is no longer experienced after that time as simply a surface of skin, but always as an internal architecture of structures, spaces, and circulatory systems. And 20 years later, for the 5th Australian Sculpture Triennial, whose theme was site-specific works, instead of a sculpture for a public space, I decided to design a sculpture for a private physiological space. Closed, the capsule could be inserted down the esophagus into the inflated stomach, but inside the stomach, the sculpture opens and closes, extends and retracts, has a flashing light and a beeping sound. So here the sculpture is not for a public space, but for a private physiological space. The body is no longer a site for the psyche, but simply a site for a sculpture. The body as a host for a work of art. So what's happening now is a time of circulating prosthetic, fractal and phantom flesh. And by circulating flesh, I mean we can extract organs from one body and insert them and animate them into another body. We can stitch the hands from a dead body onto the limbs of amputee and animate that hand. At a medical conference in Paris, I met the first double hand transplant. And after 6 months, he could move the fingers of his cadaver hand, and he had a rudimentary sense of texture, pressure, and temperature. And by fractal flesh, I mean bodies and bits of bodies spatially separated, but electronically connected, generating recurring patterns of interactivity at varying scales. And that's just a description of what's happening on the net. And phantom flesh, well, this is the realization that increasingly now we're performing with our phantom bodies online. Blender is a project, a kind of more radical anatomical architecture where the two artists, in collaboration, myself with Nina Sellers, we had 4.6 litres of our biomaterial removed. This was placed in an installation titled Blender. Blender's the inverse of the stomach sculpture. Instead of a machine choreography inside a soft organ of the body, here a machine installation becomes the host for a liquid body composed of biomaterial from the two artists' bodies. Anthropomorphic in scale and with proximity sensors around the internal of the chassis. So when you approached the installation, you would trigger the blender blades to activate, increasingly blending this liquid body composed of biomaterial from the two artists' bodies. So if we can, in the near future, engineer an artificial womb and bring to bear a healthy child, then life would not begin with a biological birth. And if we can replace malfunctioning parts of the body with stem cell grown organs, 3D bioprinted and artificial parts, then we need not die a biological death. So how do we define a human existence which has neither a beginning with birth nor an ending in death? In fact, we no longer die biological deaths. We die when our life support systems are switched off. The extra ear project was initially imaged as an ear on the side of my head, but I couldn't get anyone to agree to surgically construct it there, partly because there was a problem of partial face paralysis if the surgery went wrong. But in 2006, we were able to get 3 plastic surgeons and funding to do this surgery. This shows how the ear scaffold is inserted into the skin. It's a porous biomaterial, and when you suction the skin over the scaffold, you get this definition of an ear. And in fact, after 6 months, you get tissue ingrowth and vascularization. So the ear becomes physiologically a part of your body. During this surgery, we also inserted a small microphone in the ear construct. And The idea here is that the ear should be electronically augmented. We did test this after this first surgery. The surgeon, even with his face mask on, even with my arm wrapped in bandage with a partial plaster cast, he could speak into my ear, and his voice was wirelessly transmitted.
Through the dressings and zero-form gauze and plaster, you can still see the bars moving on our transmitter, which shows that the microphone is still picking up sound, the ear is still functionally working.
So the ear has been relocated and hopefully will still be rewired to become a remote listening device for people in other places. The ear is not for me. I've got two good ears to hear with. The idea is that the ear is for people elsewhere, an alternative anatomical architecture, a kind of internet organ for the body. This generated some other art projects. This is a 4-meter long sculpture of the ear on my arm. Oh, I'm afraid we have a problem with one of the videos, one of the images. But I decided that it would be interesting 25 years after the last suspension to suspend my body above the ear on arm sculpture. When the body assumed its full weight from the steel cable, because the steel cable is braided, it begins to untwist and the body begins to spin. The body spun for about 15 minutes before the body stopped and was lowered down. When the body's choreography was over, we replaced it with a large sculpture of my ear, and the same performance was repeated. What was interesting in this performance was that the robot which choreographs the ear is the same robot that carved the ear. So in this human-machine hybridity, the body becomes this extended operational system of bodily metabolism and machine musculature. So for me, there was always a ghost in the machine, but not as a vital force that animates, rather a fading attestation of the human. Stickman is a full body, minimal but full body exoskeleton that algorithmically actuates the body for a 5-hour continuous performance. So this is simultaneously a possessed and performing body. In fact, I had one leg free to balance on, and I could turn my body and generate new shadows on the wall, and I could modulate my video feedback projection. The exoskeleton arm was engineered for the rewired remixed performance at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art. It's a 6 degree of freedom arm that is actuated by a touchscreen interface. And in this performance for 5 days, 6 hours every day, continuously, I could only see with the eyes of someone in London. I could only hear with the ears of someone in New York, but anyone, anywhere, could access my right arm and remotely choreograph its movements. So it was a kind of distributing of agency and a sharing of visual and acoustical senses. The body was in 3 places at once. 2 places virtually in London and New York, and 1 place physically in Perth. This performance was an iteration of the rewired remix performance done in Europe, streaming live between 3 cities.
Zum Schluss noch von mir noch unbedingt, was mir direkt gesagt.
Ganz fest, ja. 1:1.
Wir gehen uns einmal gut, am Morgen die Sendung proben.
So I couldn't anticipate what I was going to see, what I was going to hear, or when someone would move me and produce the involuntary movements.
What you say? Kannst du erzählen, ich sag aber nicht cool
So bodies effectively now have become end effectors for other bodies in other places and for machines elsewhere. We're no longer simply performing with our own agency. We're collaborating physically, physiologically, cognitively, computationally with people in other places, and even with machines, surgical robots, and other kinds of systems. Reclining Stickman was a 9-meter long, 4-meter high stick figure robot, 9 degrees of freedom with bending of limbs. Its torso was continuously rotating, and it was a kind of audience, remote audience interaction, a kind of electronic voodoo. This was the web interface for the live streaming performance, and by clicking the circles, the switches in the diagram, you could watch the robot move. So this was a 5-hour performance where the body positioned on the torso of the robot could animate the limbs of the robot with a pair of pneumatic joysticks. But the artist was improvising with both local interaction through a panel of switches and the online participants who were interacting remotely. The robot is actuated by pneumatic rubber muscles. And you have to imagine the airflow muscles, the rubber muscles, inflating and contracting, exhausting and extending. So the muscles function very kind of anatomically. And when I thought of this performance, I imagined the body on the robot as a kind of contemporary Pietà. Instead of a mother and child, here's a human body on the robot. But Nina Sellers more astutely describes this as the body merely being a human strap-on for the robots. So we know now that we can 3D print with living cells. And it's going to be quite a while before we can 3D print complex organs like the human heart, because not only do you have to 3D print the structure, the blood vessels, but then you have to dump it in a vat of nutrients at 37 degrees at 37 degrees centigrade, electrically stimulate it, and hopefully the heart organ can be transplanted. But if we can 3D print living cells and into the complexity of organs, there will be an excess of organs awaiting bodies, of organs without bodies. And in 2011, the first twin turbine heart was inserted into the chest of a terminally ill patient. He lived long enough to fully test this smaller, more robust, more reliable artificial heart. But what's interesting is it circulates the blood continuously without pulsing. So in the near future, you might rest your head on your loved one's chest. They're warm to the touch. They're sighing, they're speaking, they're breathing, they're certainly alive, but they have no heartbeat. Humans are without heartbeats. So what it means to be human is perhaps not to remain human at all. And I think what artists do best is to generate contingent and contestable futures. The future doesn't happen of necessity. You have to factor in contingency, the unexpected. A future is not a future if it is not of the unexpected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. And I think there are a lot of contestable things in the presentation which we can discuss actually. Hopefully the discussion will be interesting now. And we are about to start it. I think my first question would be about your collaborations with scientists. I mean, the process itself, when you have to look for the like-minded people, and I'm pretty sure that not all scientists agreed for that. Not everybody likes contemporary art. Not everybody understands that. I'm pretty sure that the surgeon that made you the surgery on the hand with the ear was not easy to find either, and you commented on that in your talk. So how do you find scientists who are ready to collaborate, and what is their contribution?
Well, to be honest, it's really not scientists where the collaborations occur. It's with engineers, programmers, but also with, in this case, with surgeons. I think the common interests between science and art is really the technology. Artists like to use technology in unexpected ways. They like to hack the technology. They like to repurpose its uses. And I think that's what's really interesting. We don't want artists doing bad research and scientists making bad art. Because all of these projects and performances are aesthetic gestures. You know, they're done with minimum funding. And so you can't have the sort of 5-year research grants and funds to make very, very sophisticated robots or prosthetics. Having said that, most of these projects and performances are state-of-the-art, using state-of-the-art technologies.
Thank you very much. In this case, I think the body is perceived as a technology too, as a tool that can be hacked and can be used for other purposes than the ones we are used to. And I think that it's this repurposing of the body is actually using the body for its purpose in a way. So my question is, such a hack of our embodiment, can it threaten our embodiment? I mean, technologies can be hacked, machines can be hacked. And when we hack the body, does it mean that it's more sensitive, more open for invasion? So it's not just about sharing the agency with other beings, non-human beings, but it's also about sharing the power. And I think that what arises here are the questions of management, who's in control.
Well, that's so. And as Paul Virilio reminds us that with every new technology, there's a new kind of accident. So how we manage privacy, how we manage having internal components, because if you've got any kind of electronic circuitry in your body, there is the possibility of being hacked, just as there is with your computer. And of course, instead of stealing your identity, someone might steal your body. But for me, this is not so much frightening as exciting possibilities. In other words, with all of these performances, the question is not who is in control, but rather constructing a more complex, interactive and distributed body. And so that is what you're attempting to do. But they also expose the limitations of the biological body and, in fact, indicate how inadequate and profoundly obsolete the body is, because it's already being outperformed computationally, cognitively by supercomputers. A robot will not necessarily be this individuated unit. A robot might be online 24/7. It will have vast archives of information that it can access. Having a brain that is 1,400 cubic centimeters and being an individual with only certain abilities, the possibility of machines outperforming the human body are increasing. There are various strategies. One initially is to hybridize human machine systems. And the unexpected possibility is that because of micro and nano scaling, all technology in the future will be inside the human body. The human body might look exactly as it does now, but internally it'll be occupied, recolonized by nanobots, and initially to monitor pathological conditions. But imagine the possibility of redesigning the human body atoms up, inside out. It will happen so incrementally. It will be so invisible. And until the changes surface to skin level, you won't even know what's going on.
Да, действительно, спасибо. Я
Yeah,
сразу...
thank you. What comes to my mind is the latest James Bond movie where nanobots were one of the main characters, actually. Then my next question would be this, in the context of your thoughts, of your ideas. I think it can be connected with Donna Haraway's philosophy that machines are more alive than us, or they are becoming more alive than us. We are full of inertia compared to them. And in this case, what is your take on transhumanism, on post-humanism? Do you think yourself to be part of one of these movements, communities, or you go beyond this? And do you think in the terms of post-human?
Well, it's not that I don't want to be associated with transhumanism or posthumanism, but of course I was kind of doing these projects and performances before this terminology was used. And there were a number of other things in your question. Donna Haraway, yes, I would distinguish between the idea of being alive and exhibiting aliveness. So a machine is obviously not biologically alive, but it generates movement, it has senses, it has a computational brain that can process information and act upon the world. So that's how I would relate to Donna Haraway. Who I really relate to contemporary philosophers, are Bruno Latour, actor network theory, ANT for short, actor network theory, and object-oriented ontology, Graham Harman. And both of these are flattened ontology, actor network theory more so, but they expose how we relate in our contemporary society of this technological terrain. So, for example, with actor network theory, your capabilities, your meaningfulness depends on your relationships in the network. So an actor might be a body, but it also might be a machine, a bacteria. An actor can be anything. It doesn't prioritize the human. And what I like about object-oriented ontology, or more specifically, what I like about Graham Harman, is his definition of an object, or non-definition, but he makes the object a much more enticing, elusive concept. In other words, he says that you can't reduce an object to its component parts, nor can you reduce an object to its relations or effects. So for me, this was immediately seductive, because I've always spoken of the body as an object, not an object of desire, but an object that should be redesigned. But a lot of the critique of this kind of language is making a Cartesian distinction between a subject and an object, as if I'm belittling the object. You know, this body is this performing, physiological, phenomenological, cognitively aware, interactive body in the world. It's not necessary to assert a mind of its own. What you see is what you get. This body speaking words that can be translated so others can understand them. There is nothing inside this body as we popularly imagine. There is nothing inside my brain except soft tissue, billions of neurons, billions of connections, connecting to the brain stem. And in fact, it's not only my brain that is responding to the environment. It's my proprioception, my sense of touch, my visual glancing, my movement through the world. And for me, the notion of the mind, it's more of a social construct than something that you inherit as an individual. It's something that you learn through being named initially, then through your interactions with your parents, and then with larger society. So what Nietzsche and Wittgenstein allude to is that thinking, for Wittgenstein, thinking doesn't have to occur inside the head. Thinking happens with the lips that you speak, with the hands that you write or type. You know, when you try to focus on thinking, you can't focus on anything much for any length of time. It's only when you translate it into a medium that you can manipulate, like written language, that you can write a book on philosophy, or that you can write a review of an art exhibition or whatever.
Очень-очень интересно с вами вести беседу, потому
It was
что
very interesting talking to you, because things that you describe about the mind as a cultural construct make me think about the German Romantic writer Heinrich von Kleist, the author of a treatise on puppet theater. He wrote it in 1801, and he compared various dancers: a puppet on strings, an animal, and a human being. And for Kleist, the best dancer is the puppet on a string and the animal, because they don't have a mind like the human mind. They are not coy. They're not making their movements look as something else. Their movements are reflexes. They are not conscious. They are not self-conscious. They do not consider a viewer out there. They don't see even the eye of God.
да, и мне кажется, что то, как вы понимаете
And I
хореографию,
believe your view of choreography, I might be wrong, but I think your view of choreography lies very close to Kleist's idea of unconscious movement, automated movement, where a robot with which you are performing together in a way, dancing in a way, this robot becomes a better dancer, and you are not trying to imitate it, it transgresses humanity.
Well, I think, no, in fact, I would like to read this person's writing, so please send me a link to his work. I mean, my interest was this idea in terms of evolution, that every insect, animal, or human constructs their own Umwelt, constructs their own world depending on the senses that they have, the brain that they possess, how they can manipulate and move in the world. So it's not so much that I want to turn the human into a robot, but rather to understand that having a mind of our own is something that we like to attribute because we want to believe in free agency. But there are many causal reasons why this person does something. So, for example, I can say I pick up a cup and I drink coffee now, and oh, that's my free choice to do that. But in fact, there are lots of causal events before this one that determine my drinking coffee. Emails with Svetlana, you know, doing the test yesterday on the internet, and then thinking that maybe I need to keep awake and have some coffee. So there are many causal events that result in my picking up a cup of coffee. It's a free choice, but in a very limited frame of reference. So as you expand this frame of reference, as you expand the world beyond your human reach, then there are many, many causal events that will affect and even determine how you behave. Now, problematizing this, to me, is not in any way belittling the human in society, but rather feeling that we need to understand how we function. We function primarily habitually and involuntarily or automatically, as you alluded to. And unless an accident happens, we're not really aware of our bodies. If I'm not aware if I walk down the street until I trip on something, or I get sick and my stomach is painful, and then all of a sudden I notice that my stomach has a problem. But usually, if you are functioning well, then this is what happens ordinarily. And Heidegger points this out too. You know, when he talks about present at hand, so in other words, when you're using an object or an instrument, if it malfunctions, it's at that time that you become aware of it. Usually you are performing with that instrument automatically.
Yes, we are having a very lively discussion in the broadcast chat among the viewers, and Several people have asked the question on free will. A listener, Ekaterina, says, what's the place of pain in your experiments and performances? When you have these hooks, you are hanging up, and the pain is somehow eliminated from the picture. Will the human being of the future, the cyborg, be able to not experience pain, will be free of pain?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question, whether we want to program or somehow attribute emotions or experiences of pain to a robot. Do we want emotional robots? Do we want robots that lose control of their behavior? Maybe we don't want this. Having said that, pain, pathologically speaking, indicates if something is wrong with your body, and that you should take care of what you're doing. With sadomasochistic actions, having an extreme painful experience collapses that Cartesian distinction between mind and body. In a painful experience, you are one throbbing body. You can't really separate your thinking from that. So I guess the early suspension performances somewhat had this experience, but pain was never the subject of the performances. A lot of these projects and performances have been either physically challenging or technically complex. And in fact, the most difficult experience was not the suspension performance, but the stomach sculpture. It was very painful to insert the object into your body. We spent 2 days and 6 attempts to shoot about 15 minutes of video inside the body. But I had to stay in a clinic overnight because I experienced a kind of trauma, and also because we were scraping my esophagus and it began to bleed. They needed to, monitor that. So in fact, I never needed medical attention for my suspensions, but I needed medical attention for my stomach sculpture, and also for the ear project, where having left the microphone inside the ear construct, about a week later, or maybe 10 days later, the ear construct became infected. And I had to spend 1 week in hospital, every hour on the hour, flushing the ear construct to try to get rid of the infection. That was another, extreme difficulty that, constructing an ear on your arm, it seems so surgically easy, and you have anesthetic and stuff like that. But in fact, the consequences have been really difficult to manage.
Thank you. One more question from our listener, Alevtina. Can you explain your feelings during the performances with the split body, when your body is seemingly present in several places at the time? What is your mental picture at this time? How was your brain proceeding it? What were you feeling? Could you explain and describe it to us?
Yeah, it's strange. It's strange, of course, when your arm moves and you have neither initiated that movement, or are you, controlling the exoskeleton to produce that. It's done with interfaces, and it's done remotely. What the experience was, seeing with eyes in London, hearing with ears in New York, and how your brain manages that, is that you tend to focus your awareness on what's more interesting. So, for example, when I was in the Tate Modern in London, the visual experience kind of was the one that received my attention. Whereas when I heard my friends in New York in a Chinese restaurant, and Lauren's voice was in one ear and Nina's voice was in the other ear, and they were having a conversation in my head. That was what drew my attention. So I think what your body does is kind of slide its awareness between virtually between London and New York, and physically, because when I move with the exoskeleton arm, generally my body is thrown off balance and I have to pivot and regain my balance. So you're switching from being physically grounded to being virtually stimulated.
Thank you. One more question from our listener, Ivan Polizhaev. What were the most interesting societal reactions or feedbacks from your works?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I guess you have to say the ear on the arm attracted, a lot of attention in the kind of popular media, partly because it was an aesthetic gesture to, in the future, even genetically modifying your body. I mean, this is done surgically, and certainly it has its own blood supply and tissue ingrowth now. So it's physically a part of my body. But I think also people imagine that in the future you might be able to genetically engineer something like this. Or if I was trying to do this again in 10 years' time, perhaps I would 3D print the ear with living cells and 3D print the circuitry inside the ear construct. We can already print 3D print circuits inside 3D printed objects. So, it's kind of, Heidegger says you're thrown into the world. This is a body that is performing at a certain point in history with certain access to particular technologies, with limited funding because I'm an artist. And so all of my actions are crude aesthetic gestures. Scientifically, in terms of research, much more interesting and sophisticated technologies are being engineered.
Можем ли мы затронуть
Can we now touch the subject of ethics? In your presentation, you showed some works in which an AI is learning words, and we see a generated 3D face of a child reacting to stimuli from the creator, and we saw other faces. We saw a face being transplanted to an actual human being, the third face. In the context of ethics, it's important because a face-to-face talk, a face-to-face dialogue is the foundation of coexistence. Can this face-to-face dialogue be possible today when the face can hide a robot or a different creature or a human being without a face, or a human being who is contingently having to live with another person's face, a donor's face? From the point of view of ethics, how do you see it? How do you consider these experiments?
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. And today's plastic surgery, for example, with the face transplant, might be tomorrow's cosmetic surgery. And of course, since we can now 3D print with living cells, to 3D print a skin is not as difficult as 3D printing an organ. So the possibility that your facelift might be, in fact, a face transplant in the future, yeah, that's a possibility. I think cinematically and in sci-fi, we're simulating what might happen physically. So in a way, ethics is not a stable construct. Ethics are adjusted, and ethics is a kind of dynamic system that has to adjust. So for example, a couple of 100 years ago, who would imagine in vitro fertilization, you know? I think several years ago, a woman in Texas, I think it was 24 or 25 years old, gave birth from a frozen embryo that had been frozen for 21 years. So, you know, and they think that they can freeze embryos successfully for at least 50 years. So what does this mean? What does this mean? This means that we are disconnecting our human lifespan from our reproductive processes. In other words, an example might be that your twin is born on your deathbed. And of course, you might carry the baby of someone who has been deceased for several generations. So ethically now, we kind of accept that. We wouldn't have accepted it or even imagined it, you know, even 100 years ago.
Да, действительно, согласна с вами.
Thank you. Completely agree with you. We also spoke about science fiction. We have a question from Anastasia. Do you have favorite sci-fi movies, games, books in cyberpunk in particular, or in sci-fi in general?
Well, I know some science fiction writers I've met, for example, William Gibson, and he actually wrote a foreword for my publication. William Gibson's, my favorite statement from his is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. In terms of favorite ideas, favorite movies, well, I guess 2001 was the first movie that I went to see more than once. That was a long time ago. but Blade Runner, which you might know or have seen, recent movies, not so interesting. I didn't find AI very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing Dune, but I really liked the original Dune. So I'm very fascinated about how they will, you know, differently and cinematically show this. So, yeah, I guess they're my favorite movies. I guess I read more than go to movies. Or I watch more YouTube tutorials than I go to movies.
Да, но я должна сказать, что новая Дюна очень
I must say
красивая.
that the new Dune is very beautiful. So I hope that you will like it. We have to finish soon, unfortunately, although this is a very interesting conversation and people in the chat are extremely active. We keep having questions. I think to close, I will ask maybe the final question for today, which would possibly sum up our conversation. So I wanted to ask about this hybridization, machine-human. Do you think we need boundaries? To what extent can we expand our bodies? Should we stop at some point? Or do you think we should reject the body? Do you think we should accept aging as a compulsory thing? Or do you think there is some point after which we will stop being human?
Well, of course, the human is an unstable construct. It's a historical construct. It changes and is adjusted. So, for example, you are human even if you have an artificial arm. You are human if you have a heart transplant. You are human if you have in your brain a device that will prevent you from exhibiting Parkinson's disease. At another medical conference, I saw a Parkinson's patient. This is when you lose control of your body. And they showed videos of him before the implant. And then you see him on stage speaking normally. He can feed himself now. He can dress himself now. So initially, these things are going to happen for medical reasons. You know, they will be justified ethically for medical reasons, for patching up the body. But of course, there's already serious research, for example, a research community that calls itself Augmented Humans. It does research on how to augment the human body, not only physically with exoskeleton attachments, but also cognitively and sensorially. So one can say that it's difficult to establish boundaries because these boundaries are increasingly broken down. But of course, the question is, for example, if you can have a head transplant, if you can have artificial arms, artificial legs, a twin turbine heart, are you still human if you still have a human brain? So I think the idea of the human is going to be continuously deconstructed the body is going to be continuously reconfigured and perhaps even redesigned.
Thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. Thank you. I'm very grateful to everybody who asked questions. Thank you very much for the discussions in the chat. That was mostly informative. Of course, we'll publish the recording of the talk in both languages, in the original and with the translation. And I just wanted to remind you that we will have another talk on the 9th of November with Marina Abramovich. You're most welcome to register for this talk on the website of our school in the tab Beyond Boundaries. Mr. Stelarc, from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you. That was so inspiring and so informative. And I think we're all leaving with a lot of questions and we'll keep thinking. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.